In this unit, we'll discuss the realities of second language acquisition in outer and expanding circles in the light of beliefs that SLA has about second language learning. In the outer and expanding circle context, we see that learners often learn English to communicate with each other. So the interlocutors, more often than not, are non-native speakers of English. Whereas an assumption of SLA is that people learn an L2 to be able to communicate with native speakers. But we see, for example, in Pakistan that people learn English and continue using their learned English or the language they've learned with other Pakistanis. And it is very few Pakistanis who get an opportunity to use English with native speakers of English. So we have these perfectly competent or quite competent users of English in Pakistan who use English to communicate with other Pakistani English speakers. Similarly, another assumption or an assumption linked with the desire or the use of an L2, the use of an L2 being to be able to communicate with native speakers is the target that one has for learning an L2, which is a native-like competence. So the target variety, which is the aim of any L2 learners of English, is standard British or American variety. But the reality is that if one uses native English in these contexts, outer and expanding circle contexts, such a speaker or user of English is viewed unfavorably. So we must have observed ourselves that when a person uses a British or American accent or pronunciation when speaking, that person is often made fun of or is considered a show-off, or if not a show-off, he or she is considered a snob. So, trying to follow native English norms or copy native English norms is not looked favorably in all the contexts. Another assumption of SLA is that the input available to the learner should comprise the entire range and depth of English in American and British varieties of English. Again, it is not possible in the outer and expanding circle countries. In these contexts, the input usually comprises teachers, the language used by teachers who use an indigenized variety. So the teachers, peers, friends of the learners, and also the materials, they are all based in the local context, and they all comprise or use indigenized varieties of English and not a native variety of English. Another fact that cannot be overlooked is that in these contexts of English, both expanding and outer circle, learners have several languages in their linguistic repertoire. So they use several languages at the same time. Each of these languages has a distinct function. So they may use their mother tongue for one function, for performing one function, a local common language for another function, and English for yet another function. So this idea of a bilingual who's fully competent in the two languages or all the languages that he or she uses is completely irrelevant to the reality of outer and expanding circle Englishes, or to the reality of most of the context of English as L2 learning. It is because users of English in these contexts know other languages than English. The other languages are likely to influence their use of English, and also because the range of use of English is limited to certain domains only, the possibility of these learners attaining native-like competence, general native-like competence, is impossible. Therefore, this ideal bilingual concept or this idea concept of ideal bilingualism is completely irrelevant to these contexts. There are certain functions that English performs in these contexts which are very unique to these contexts. We do not see functions which are comparable to these functions in native English-speaking countries and contexts. For example, if one is trying to explain how to make biryani in English, so this function is specific only to Pakistani context or at the most Indian and Bangladeshi context. So, the functions of English in these contexts are unique, and in some cases, English serves the role of a high variety. So, in a diglossic context, for example, in a context where two languages are used side by side, which is what diglossia is. When two languages are used side by side, each has its own distinct function, but one variety is considered a high variety, or one language is given the status of a high variety because it enjoys an avert prestige and is reserved for more formal functions. English plays the same role in these contexts. Even when it is used side by side with other languages, it enjoys this avert prestige compared to other languages, for example, in Pakistan and to some extent in India as well. So it is reserved for more formal functions, higher education, court of law, bureaucracy, etc. English in other contexts of use, performing other functions, overlaps with other local languages, but this overlap takes place to perform more informal functions. For example, chatting with family members, having a conversation with a friend on the phone, etc. So in these contexts, English overlaps with regional languages or primary languages of the users. So we see the realities of the use of English or learning of English as an L2 in outer and expanding circle countries are very different from the assumptions which are made by SLA for learning a second language.